Now speaking, Mike Sullivan, Corporate Vice President. Applied Materials held their second quarter of fiscal 2023 earnings call. Joining the call were CEO Gary Dickerson and CFO Bryce Hill. The call included forward-looking statements and non-GAAP financial measures. Additionally, Applied Materials will be hosting a Semicon West Technology Breakfast on July 11th with a major new platform announcement in a heterogeneous integration panel featuring executives from AMD, Intel, Qualcomm, Bessie and EV Group. No webcast will be available, so registration is required for. Now speaking, Gary Dickerson, President and Chief Executive Officer. In Q2 2023, Applied Materials delivered strong results with revenues at the high end of guidance. The company's outlook is favorable due to its balanced market exposure and strong position at key technology inflections, driving demand for their differentiated products, especially in metal deposition, CVD, etch, implant, thermal processing, and e-beam. Despite macro headwinds, semiconductor markets remain robust due to global incentives, $400 billion over 5 years, and strategic investments in clean energy, electric vehicles, and industrial automation. Applied will formally announce a major strategic investment in a new high-velocity innovation platform on May 22. Now speaking, Bryce Hill, Chief Financial Officer. Applied Materials delivered strong Q2 results and expects to continue to grow in Q3. The company is forecasting revenue of $6.15 billion, plus or minus $400 million, and non-GAAP EPS of $1.74, plus or minus 18 cents. They are also making a multi-billion-dollar investment in new infrastructure to expand their capacity to collaborate with customers and develop next-generation materials, processes, and equipment. In March, the board approved a 23% dividend per share increase, the largest increase in 5 years, and supplemented their share buyback program with a new $10 billion repurchase authorization. Operating cash flow during the quarter was nearly 35% of revenue and free cash flow was nearly 31% of revenue. Applied Materials is expecting the semiconductor industry to reach $1 trillion by 2030 and believe their free cash flow can continue to grow and support increasing the dividend at an accelerated rate over the next several years. Now speaking, Mike Sullivan, Corporate Vice President. I asked one question on today's call to help us reach as many people as possible. If I had another question, I had to re-queue and the operator would do their best to come back to me later in the Evercore IC analyst CJ Muse inquired, do you have visibility into the sustainability of spending for lagging edge in China beyond 2023? With 20 to 30 new players emerging in the first 3 rounds of DC funding, what is your outlook on their build plans and how they will sustain spending? Bryce Hill replied, we are very bullish on the end markets driving investments in China. Specifically, we've seen our equipment being installed and ramped. We do not see any pre-ordering or stocking of equipment and it is mostly ICAPS focused on power, video processors, sensors and power end markets. There is a long tail of investors in China with government incentives that are ramping and installing the equipment. AllianceBernstein analyst Stacy Rasgon inquired, have non-Chinese regions been growing faster than China due to their smaller size? How much of ICAPS revenue is generated in China and how has this figure been changing compared to other regions? Bryce Hill replied, China is the largest country in the ICAPS space, but 3 other countries are growing faster. Government stimulus programs encourage investments in mature technologies and utilization remains healthy. In 2022, ICAPS saw a 40% plus growth rate which has only accelerated this year, and analysts expect demand to remain stable in the coming years. Gary Dickerson replied, I spoke with CEOs in the US and Europe who are in a strong economic position and making sustainable investments that will last the next several years. These investments, according to Bryce, were also meaningful. Bank of America Merrill Lynch analyst Vivek Arya inquired, have the backlog of applied semi-systems increased in 2020, and is the second half of the year expected to be better than the first half compared to peers in the industry? Bryce Hill replied, Applied has a backlog that is still elevated due to customers planning ahead longer than usual. The ICAPS business has grown significantly this year, offsetting any potential weakness from the memory and leading logic markets. Applied does not have growth in the upcoming quarter but expects the current dynamic to continue in future quarters. Cohen and Company analyst Krish Sankar inquired, have all the regionalization and spending on meetings been tied to back funding or other factors? Did Bryce mention anything about China export control recovery in the back half of the year? Gary Dickerson replied, there is intense competition for leadership among companies in the leading edge, driving roadmaps for power, performance and cost. 3 nanometer is expected to be a big node with lots of customer demand. Applied has good position as customers move to 3 nanometer, with more than 20% steps up from 5 to 3 nanometer. Government incentives are also being supplied regionally for leading edge and ICAPS, which will be an adder for systems and service business over the next few years. Bryce Hill replied, I have reviewed the China export controls and found that some factories can be shipped to in the second half of this year. This is consistent with what our peers have reported. Citi analyst Atif Malik inquired, have you gained 5 points of transistor share from FinFET to Gate-All-Around due to growth in the total addressable market, TAM, or due to taking away from other areas like lithography? Does this include contribution from Sculpta? Gary Dickerson replied, I have determined that Gate-All-Around technology presents a $1 billion opportunity for Applied and that they are well positioned to take advantage of it due to their strong products and technology. Furthermore, share gains come from FinFET transistors, with a 5-point increase. Materials engineering is increasing in importance with wiring resistance being one of the biggest issues in the industry, as well as backside power distribution which can provide up to 30% area savings without changing feature size. In the future, people will be stacking nanosheets for another transistor technology. Jefferies analyst Mark Lipassi inquired, what is the biggest investment opportunity for Gary and his team that has the potential to reach the same level of success as ICAPS? Gary Dickerson replied, I asked a question about ICAPS, International Conference on Automated Planning and Scheduling, and Mark responded by asking if I was referring to the conference. Jefferies analyst Mark Lipassi inquired, have any of the other investments Applied Materials has made recently have the potential to be as profitable and successful as ICAPS? Gary Dickerson replied, I'm excited about 2 areas of opportunity for our customers going forward. Materials engineering, which is seeing tremendous spending and involving complex innovations in transistor, wiring and memory technologies. I anticipate that Sculpta's directional edge technology will bring cost-effective area scaling. In addition, packaging is a $1 billion business for us today, anticipated to double in the next few years. We have a strong position in the served markets with high share, and new opportunities from chiplet and heterogeneous integration. Goldman Sachs analyst Toshihari inquired, have you seen any signs of recovery in your memory business? What explains the strength of your Korean business despite industry-wide weakness in memory? Bryce Hill replied, Bryce believes that memory prices are currently at historical lows, with the ideal market split being 1/3 memory and 2/3 logic. In the past quarter, pricing, utilization, and inventories have all been moving in the wrong direction. However, Bryce believes that with growth in ICAPS and long-term outlook for leading edge, memory will turn around soon. Shipments in Korea were strong in the quarter, but overall there is still weakness in the market. Gary Dickerson replied, we have seen a long-term trend of 2/3/1/3 in terms of foundry logic, with continued strength in the race for leadership and leading-edge technology in ICAPS going forward. It is unlikely that this trend will change in the near future. J.P. Morgan Chase & Company analyst Harlan Sur inquired, have customer rescheduling and cancellation activity, which was high during periods of spending weakness, stabilized since last quarter's earnings call? Bryce Hill replied, this quarter saw weakness in NAND and push-outs on the leading edge, affecting our guide for the next quarter. Customers are optimizing roadmaps in reaction to the current environment. The ICAPS business has been strong, overcoming most of the noise, catching up on back orders, and is expected to continue being an important component of demand going forward. Implant is still working to catch up. UBS analyst Timur Curry inquired, have the underlying demand for lagging edge chips in China been from a lack of availability from US and European chip manufacturers, or is it primarily related to this year's WFE? Bryce Hill replied, we raised our expectations of demand in China during the quarter, and there is now a total of 100 fab projects globally, with a significant amount in ICAPS. We believe that China is localizing its supply of components such as sensors, power chips, analog chips, and microcontrollers, and imports of these components are declining despite growing demand. Investments in China's capacity are being made to match their demand function, with government incentives for this goal. Gary Dickerson replied, I look at fab utilization, wafer starts and good chips out to model the vertical markets of ICAPS. The growth rate is roughly in line with our assumptions. Wells Fargo Securities analyst Joe Quattrochi inquired, can you provide insight into the capital intensity of domestic China relative to more experienced customers, and how do you anticipate that changing over time? Gary Dickerson replied, capital intensity in ICAPS has been high for the past 5 to 8 years, with new equipment sets leading to a lack of reuse, particularly in China. This is consistent with most ICAPS additions globally and is a major factor in the upsurge in WFE, semiconductor, intensity over time. Deutsche Bank analyst Sidney Ho inquired, have AGS revenues grown this year despite headwinds? What drove the upside in the quarter, given underutilization across foundry, logic and memory? What should we expect for AGS growth in the second half of the year now that memory suppliers have reduced utilization? Gary Dickerson replied, AGS business is broken down to 85% spares and services, with more than 60% coming from long-term agreements of 2.6 years in length. Renewal rates are still very high due to these longer-term agreements, providing stability in the current market environment. The other 15% comes from 200mm ICAPS business, which is stable and growing in 20. Bryce Hill replied, we expect our utilization to grow year over year, despite slower growth in Q3. We have accounted for lower utilization in some factories when making our outlook. Gary Dickerson replied, I am growing this year and still on track to achieve low double-digit growth for AGS in the long term, as previously discussed 2 years ago. Stifel Financial Corporation analyst Brian Chin inquired, have our expectations for the linearity of ICAPS business in the second half of the year been affected by industry weakness in memory and advanced logic foundry, as well as any potential impact from China? Bryce Hill replied, I have seen an increasing trend in ICAPS quarter over quarter from Q3 of last year to Q2 this year. I cannot provide guidance about the second half of the year, but I do not believe there was a front-loaded phenomenon. Gary Dickerson replied, I have seen significant demand for our ICAPS products, with 10 new products launched in the last few years. We are a supply-constrained business, however, so I expect ICAPS to continue ramping up and closing the gap between supply and demand. This will continue driving our ICAPS strength. Needham & Company analyst Quinn Bolton inquired, do I expect a benefit of at least $300 million in the second half from China export clarifications due to higher market share in China? Bryce Hill replied, I have seen the same situation with a small number of customers. I can confirm that we will be able to ship to our factories in the second half of the year, starting from Q3. Needham & Company analyst Quinn Bolton inquired, can you give us a range of what ICAPS' relative strength in advanced foundry logic is expected to be for 2023? Bryce Hill replied, ICAPS is the largest market this year, with significant growth seen both last year and this year. We believe ICAPS is stable and long-term, it will be relatively equal to foundry logic WFE. Barclays analyst Blaine Curtis inquired, have you seen any signs of a rebound for the leading-edge segment given that some markets may recover in the second half, despite the low current utilizations? Bryce Hill replied, Blaine, utilization for leading-edge factories is relatively low, around 70%. Push-outs are project and site-specific and do not signal a change in customers' direction. The most important transition ahead for Applied is to Gate-All-Around, which will start in 2024. This transition will drive value for Applied. Gary Dickerson replied, I believe 3nm technology will be an important contribution to revenue for Applied in 2021 and Gate-All-Around spending will meaningfully ramp up in 2024. Mizuho Securities analyst Vijay Rakesh inquired, have you estimated how much the government funding of $400 billion will add to global WFE in the second half of 2023 or 2024? Bryce Hill replied, the global phenomenon is estimated to add 3 to 7% of WFE, workforce equipment, over the next 5 years. It will set locations for customers to place their assets, and due to lack of economies of scale, a small amount of incremental equipment is expected. Additionally, companies are already starting to accrue for some of the tax benefits as incentives to encourage investment. Mizuho Securities analyst Vijay Rakesh inquired, can we expect ICAPS spending in China to remain steady next year, but memory spending to decline again year over year? Bryce Hill replied, we anticipate that ICAPS will remain successful, but memory and leading-edge logic are both dependent on macroeconomic factors in consumer markets in the upcoming year. Susquehanna International Group analyst Mehdi Hosseini inquired, can I hit revenue targets without WFE being above $90 billion in FY22, and how do government subsidies impact the cycle and volatilities of the industry going forward, referencing what happened in the last few years? Bryce Hill replied, Mehdi is looking to model the potential earnings over the next couple of years. Our AGS business is expected to continue to grow and our display business has upsides. We anticipate no growth in WFE, but $90 billion should support larger earnings. Gary Dickerson replied, Bryce discussed an incremental spending of 3 to 7% over the next few years. Due to competition between different locations, customers will invest based on where they see demand, and while the timing might not be significantly different than in the past, there is a benefit as companies move into new regions. Initial efficiency will be lower, which is a help for the service business. Mike Sullivan replied. Mehdi's presentation concluded with one last question or follow-up. AllianceBernstein analyst Stacy Rasgon inquired, do the investment plans discussed next week aim to increase Gate-All-Around's market share by 5 points? What kind of resources and support will they provide that others cannot? Gary Dickerson replied, I have been working with some of our largest customers to accelerate time to innovation and reduce the time from concept to high-volume manufacturing. We believe there are opportunities to drive certain steps in parallel, which could significantly reduce this timeline. We think materials, inflections, new structure and design technology co-optimization can be a bigger part of the roadmap for energy-efficient computing. At Semicon event, we will discuss this further and how economic optimization through R&D dollars can create value. AllianceBernstein analyst Stacy Rasgon inquired, this is more than just a new product, it is an innovative industry. Gary Dickerson replied, I think the scale of what we're discussing is much larger than our current operations and the concepts of how we'll manage the entire ecosystem are exciting. Mike Sullivan replied, Bryce, closed out the call today. Numerical data, dates and buzzwords were discussed. Bryce Hill replied, we have seen areas of weakness in our markets this year, but Applied is making good operating progress and outperforming the markets due to its breadth and diversity. We are confident about the industry's long-term growth potential and plan to make significant investments for our future and increased cash returns to shareholders. On Monday, we will detail our strategic investment for close collaboration with customers. Gary will. Mike Sullivan replied, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. A replay of the call will be available on the IR page of our website by 5 p.m. PT. I also want to thank everyone for their continued interest in